Well, thank you for inviting me to this annual meeting of the Australia-New Zealand Police Forces. In the past, I've had the opportunity to speak in person to both police departments in New Zealand and in Australia. And I'm very sorry that circumstances make it impossible for me to come and speak to you in person today, but I'm glad I will have a chance to address you. In this presentation, I will examine a paradox in American policing: steep declines in crime without corresponding increases in public trust in the police. My argument will be that this is a reflection of the style of policing that has been widely adopted in America. My suggestion is that the American police have a lot to gain from changing their style, and by extension, that departments in other countries should hesitate before they adopt it. And what I'll try to tell you about is some of the controversies that have resulted from this approach to policing. The countries that you represent show that it is possible to police a modern democratic society while maintaining a substantial reservoir of trust and confidence among residents. Recent surveys suggest that about 77% of the residents of New Zealand trust their police force, 68% of the residents of Australia. Similarly, 74% of the residents in the United Kingdom express trust in their police. Against this background, it is striking that only 48% of adult Americans express confidence in their local police. These low ratings in America are not a sudden response to recent events. Between 40 and 50% of Americans have expressed a lack of confidence in their local police for decades. It's only in the light of recent events that this percentage has risen more towards 50%. This means that about half of the people in America say they do not trust their local police department. And of course, as you might expect, trust among minority group members, which in America is primarily Black Americans, is much lower, recently 37% lower. The low level of public trust in the police is striking because during this same period, moving from 1980 to now, America has moved away from an era of high violent crime to an era of low violent crime. There's been a steady decline in violent crime in America for decades. COVID has confounded this trend, but recent estimates of the COVID effect suggested most a 16% increase in violent crime, and the rate of increase is already leveling off. Even with that blip, crime rates remain substantially lower than their 1980s levels. Recent discussions of a crime wave in America are obscuring the reality that crime in general has become and remains low. The one area where crime is rapidly gaining in America is gun-involved homicides. These crimes are terrible, but their solution is not primarily a policing issue. It is an issue that's confronting the gun culture of America, which is a legacy of our frontier heritage. These acts of violence aside, crime today is low relative to the past. So what we have today in America is the paradox of crime declines without increases in public trust in the police. These low levels in trust, in turn, are leading to many of the controversies about policing that you read about every day in the newspaper. My suggestion in this talk is that being distrusted is not intrinsic to policing. That's something you know already because trust is much higher in your own countries. It is instead a byproduct of the style that American police have adopted. In the year after the large-scale protests and social movements ignited by the death of George Floyd in Minnesota, there have been efforts to reform the American police. To date, political and popular resistance to these pressures has led to a lack of significant changes in national policing policy. The changes that have occurred in certain local communities. Pressure to change policing in America has generally lost steam. The question that the American police need to ask is why they might want to change if they don't have to. And you should ask a parallel question. Why would you want to adopt the kind of changes that I'm proposing for them? I will argue that even though the momentum for change is slowing, the police would benefit from changing anyway. The changes that I'm going to advocate are not changes in the law concerning officer liability for the use of force, our national tracking systems for police officers. They're changes in the structure of American policing. Well, what are the problems in American policing today and how should they be addressed? During a period of high violent crime in America during the 1970s and 80s, the police in America grew in size and increasingly adopted the mission of harm reduction via crime control, with a particular focus on violent gun and drug-related crimes. To achieve this goal, police departments concentrated power and policymaking within themselves and implemented their policies within local communities through command and control strategies backed up with sanctions and the potential of coercion. At the same time, the police accepted the idea that they should prevent crime, not just solve crimes. To do so, they adopted proactive policing strategies to preempt criminal activity. A 2004 National Academy of Sciences report on policing documents these changes and justifiably lauds the American police for their greater effectiveness and professionalism. For a variety of reasons, including more effective policing, the crime rate in America has steadily declined over the last several decades. The good news is, as crime has declined, fear of crime has diminished as a national issue. The police should feel very proud to be a part of that change. They have helped to build a climate of reassurance that has enabled communities in America to develop. The bad news for police organizations is that in an era of low crime, there is less justification for the current level of police person power in America. As I said, crime has diminished strikingly, but police staffing levels remain as high as they were at the height of the crime wave decades ago. Large police forces continue with less justification in terms of crime rates. What is more important from my perspective is that the police have continued to police with a warrior style focused on combating violent crime and criminals. The warrior culture of American policing trains officers to approach problems primarily through the lens of using force to compel compliance. This skill set is a mismatch for what the police do today. Studies of what the police do all day suggest that the warrior skill set is central to only around 4% of the tasks that the police perform in their daily jobs. A recent analysis by Cynthia Lum, focusing on response to calls, found that about 9% of the time that the police spend in responding to calls is related to calls that have anything to do with the use of force or with violence. However you cut it, most of what the police do does not require an armed response by a person trained and equipped to deploy force to compel compliance. The warrior skill set is not only not helpful for dealing with many everyday policing problems, it actually intensifies conflict in many cases. It makes every situation one of control and domination, provoking hostility, anger, and defiance. The problems with the warrior style of policing in America have been intensified by social forces that have nothing to do with the police. In recent decades, the American government has continually retreated from the task of providing social services in urban communities. As a consequence, the police have increasingly been dealing with a wide variety of services, ranging from managing everyday disorder and domestic disputes to dealing with homelessness and mental illness, for which an armed police officer trained to deploy force to obtain coerced compliance is not a desirable solution. Many police officers agree and do not consider such tasks to be real police work. They have been conscripted into doing them by a lack of other municipal services. The police are increasingly the default agency for dealing with a range of social issues and urban problems, for which they are not trained and at which they are not particularly effective. The current style of American policing is also a more general problem because it does not build public support for the police, either among those who deal with the police or in the broader population. The police in America have been operating under the assumption that by proactively managing crime, they would build public loyalty. However, empirical research shows that this is not an accurate model of the antecedents of trust. People do not evaluate the police primarily in terms of their crime-fighting effectiveness. But what is to be done? One argument, which is currently being highly politicized, is that we should defund the police. This inflammatory rhetoric in America has not been helpful. A more neutral statement is that we might restrict the police to dealing with real policing problems, problems that require the capacity to deploy force to compel violence, to combat violence, to compel compliance. As I noted, many police officers dislike social work and themselves advocate such a change. Bring the police into a situation where they manage violence and they use force to compel compliance. What they do not advocate at the same time is the reduction in funding for the police that would be necessary to reallocate resources to social and other municipal services to take up the slack if the police were only doing real police work. The problem is that in an era of diminishing resources, and for cities that are facing many challenges, ranging from managing social services to rebuilding infrastructure and combating climate change, it's a challenge in their budget to maintain a large police department focused on traditional policing against lower levels of crime, and at the same time provide funding for other agencies to manage other problems. There is another approach. The alternative is to change the culture of American police departments and the style of policing. It is not intrinsic to policing to police in a warrior style. And in fact, it's not even something that has always been true of American policing. It is the style that became dominant during the high crime wave in the 1970s and 1980s. And this coercive turn in criminal justice was not confined to the police. At the same time, there was a growth in draconian sentences that led to mass imprisonment, which has made America a society characterized by an extremely high proportion of its population being in prison. I'm a researcher at the Justice Collaboratory at Yale Law School. Our efforts are directed at building evidence-informed criminal justice policies of the type that you heard in the previous presentation. In the case of the police, this has meant demonstrating that a style of policing built around procedural justice is a viable alternative for the police. That style emphasizes a focus on the experience of the people being policed. These people need to feel listened to. They need to understand why the police are acting as they are. They need to feel respected, and they need to trust that the police care about everyday citizens' problems, needs, and concerns. When people have this experience with the police become legitimate. They trust them. They view the police as entitled to exercise authority, and they're more accepting of and deferential to that authority. Police officers operating from a warrior model often see this approach as weak and soft. Research suggests that it is not. Policing through trust is found to lead to compliance as effectively as the warrior model of policing through coercion. And it does so without provoking anger and defiance. Observational research by John McCluskey shows that coercive strategies are not more effective in gaining compliance, and they're more likely to provoke anger and resistance. More generally, legitimacy encourages everyday law abidingness as effectively as does a sanction-based approach. The payoff of legitimacy-based policing is that trust motivates cooperation more effectively than does sanctioning. The police today complain about the lack of cooperation from the community, which makes it harder to solve crimes and do their jobs. Legitimacy motivates cooperation. A common finding is that greater legitimacy heightens clearance rates because people report crimes, identify criminals, testify in court, and when jurors accept police testimony. Perhaps most important, when people in a community trust the police, they identify with and engage in their communities. The police often say that you cannot arrest your way out of crime. To lower crime and keep it low, you need to develop communities socially, politically, and economically. That goal is best achieved through creating a trusted police force. A trusted police force supports resilience, promotes development, and in general reassures people and encourages them to get involved with others and in their communities. The issue in America today is whether there will be a shift in the style of policing towards this trust-based model. There are institutional forces working against it, and reformers themselves scored what I would call an own goal by their poorly chosen slogan, defund the police. That slogan has frightened many members of their communities, including many minority group members who depend on the police for protection. But what role can evidence play? Evidence tells us what can work instead. Here, the evidence is clear and compelling. The same level of law-abidingness and deference to police directives can be achieved through a legitimacy-based approach. And the police can also, at the same time, build partnerships with the community to promote well-being and vitality. Is this desirable for the police? Yes. First, it gives the police a role during a low crime period that takes advantage of the reality that the police in America are often the most competent and effective municipal agencies in a city. They can be the foundation of a strategy of community development. They can create a climate of reassurance. This makes sense because dealing with problems in the community has become our new federal government high priority. For example, dealing with the conditions that are background to gun violence. So if the police are instrumental to addressing those kind of problems, they are central to the concerns of our government about what is important to manage at this era in our history. This also gives the police a solid justification for their existence. Evidence shows that the broad strategies of proactive policing utilized in recent decades are not effective. And that was addressed in the previous presentation. Also, targeted hotspots are focused deterrence, better manages problems of crime and disorder. And these targeted strategies require only a smaller number of police officers. It's hard to honestly justify current policing levels without rethinking what the police are going to be doing in the community. Making such a change is not challenging. The police can change their style of policing with very little cost through reimagining their mission and via retraining. The key is changing police culture. I've participated in several studies of police training. We've shown you can change police behavior in the kinds of ways that I've talked about. This shift is also good for the police themselves. One of the byproducts of a coercive model of policing is stress on police officers. American policing is a career associated with high levels of stress, leading to a wide variety of health and well-being problems for the police. Officers suffer from hypertension and other physical illnesses. They have high rates of depression, suicide, alcoholism, and drug use. You might say this is all a necessary byproduct of doing a tough job, but that is not true. Research suggests that it is more connected to a style of policing than the fact of being a police officer. And an important component of that is the same research shows that procedural justice within a police department, that is on the part of superiors towards line officers, promotes their physical and mental health, encourages their loyalty and view that their superiors are legitimate, and also
we are hopeful of getting Professor Tom Tyler back on the screen. We are hopeful to bring him back. As we say, we've had just a couple of technical difficulties, but we'll find our way through them. So apologies for that. And as I said, we hope to have Professor Tom Tyler back with us soon. Again, joining me is Mark Evans. You're doing a great job, Mark. Thanks very much. Look, we've got a couple of questions actually already that we were going to put to Tom, and if we can bring him back online, we'll ask some of those questions as well. But there's one here now that you might be able to help us out with, if that's okay, from one of our audience members, which asks, what is the single biggest change police could make in order to build trust, confidence, and be perceived as legitimate in the eyes of our communities?
Well, I think Tom's conversation about the extent to which American law enforcement has probably lost a bit of sense of purpose, and the style of policing is such that clearly the community has lost a sense of really what their police service is about, and it's a feature of the conversation in Australia and New Zealand, I have to say, which is about how do we ensure that we do retain that public trust and confidence in policing, and the style of policing is fundamentally important to that. And I know Tom, in his observations around training, and particularly I was struck with the observations around wellness. If you're not well and your police service is not well and is stressed, it's very difficult to deliver a service to the community. So I think that wellness piece is really, really important.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. I think we have Tom back now. We'll take you back to Professor Tom Tyler.
Okay, well, this is an interesting environment to be speaking to you, so I hope I'll be able to say the rest. So the point is that the police have a lot to gain by changing, because policing is a tough job for police, both in terms of their style in the community and then the style that they experience within the station house. One of the things that comes up in America all the time is the danger, because it is such a heavily gun-oriented society. And I would emphasize to you that the research that I've seen supports the argument that unarmed officers are not at greater risk than armed officers. I say that tentatively because I think we need more research, but I do think that the danger imperative that the police carry around with them that leads them to feel they need weapons is overstated. Okay. So let me just then move on and say that I think the most challenging problem in American criminal justice is a history of evidence-free criminal justice policy and practice. Several of the major and costly changes in policy during the era of high crime continue in spite of evidence that they didn't work at the time and they don't work now. And I'll use the example of stop, question, and frisk, and another example is long-term imprisonment, neither of which has been found by research to particularly be effective in lowering crime. Now, speaking to this group, I want to acknowledge the irony of saying that because the field of criminology is heavily research-based, it seems strange to say that policies don't follow evidence, but this is really more a product of the American political culture that is highly politicized and not evidence-driven. And many of our criminal justice policies are based upon moral panics and political expediency more than they're based upon evidence. Okay, well, so let me just conclude with three sort of bottom line observations. One is that Peel was right in his London police principles in saying that the relationship between the police and the community is at the center of his policing model and has to be at the center of every policing model. Losing sight of that has cost American police a lot. Right now, you're seeing that. The second thing is evidence is only helpful if you actually use it. And you should not be doing what doesn't work. You should be doing what does work. But the key is being able to achieve some separation from politics. And clearly, this has not gone particularly well in America in criminal justice in recent years. And then finally, the best way to deal with change is to find a new way to be useful. And I'll give an example of the parallel to the police, which is the fire department in America. During the same period that I've talked about, the number of fires in America was down 50%, but the number of firefighters was up 50%. Well, why? Because firefighters reinvented themselves as emergency medical workers. So often in America, when we have a medical emergency, a fire truck comes up. So the fire officers found a way to be useful in a different world. And everybody loves firemen. So they found a way to be popular too. Okay, so then just finally, I think many police officers that I've spoken to in Australia and New Zealand are already aware of research and have adopted a more trust-oriented style of policing. So I say good for you. And I think that you will reap the benefits of evidence-based policing in this arena. And I'm, of course, hoping that that will also come to be true in America. So thank you.
Tom, thank you so much for that informative and insightful presentation to us today. We really appreciate that. We've got some time for questions, Tom, and I hope you don't mind taking some time to answer the many questions that we're having coming through. And again, if you've got any questions, those attendees and those watching, again, please post those on our Q&A facility and we will ask them on your behalf. So, Tom, our first question, what do you think it will take for American policing as a whole to adopt the principles of legitimacy?
I think that many police commanders endorse those principles. And in fact, a study of police commanders when Biden came into office, 73% of them listed legitimacy-based policing as one of their central goals. I think what's going to be necessary is a change in the political climate to support that approach to policing. I believe at this point it's more of a problem in our popular culture than it is convincing police commanders to do it.
Another question here, Tom. This one from Rachel Gerritsen. Thank you, Rachel, for your question. In your opinion, Tom, is a buyback scheme for guns even a possibility in the United States to reduce the need for police officers to be armed to feel safe to do their job?
Well, buyback schemes have been implemented and they have been successful to some extent. It has to be acknowledged that the problem is so extensive in America that any one policy like that is unlikely to be enough to address the underlying issue. There really need to be much stricter rules for buying guns, buying ammunition, registration, particularly of automatic weapons. And this is a very challenging political issue. As I mentioned, I think as most people know, that America has a romance with guns that comes out of its frontier heritage and its imagined frontier heritage. I would emphasize that I think that the police, while they have faced real dangers, really overestimate in their presentation to their officers the risk they face, because that risk, well, it's there. It's not really as high as you would imagine if you listen to the culture. So I think part of it is trying to lower the number of guns, obviously, and another is trying to get concern about gun violence among police officers into proportion to the actual risk that officers face.
Another question here, Tom. This one from Sandra Smith. Sandra, thank you again for your question. Given the majority of the community obtain their impressions of police from the media, how do police agencies navigate the 24/7 global media agenda to ensure and maintain legitimacy and trust in their community?
I think that police leaders have realized that media is a two-way street. And that, for example, social media, police commanders can build social networks. They can send out newsletters, they can send out questions, what kind of policies do you want to have, what kind of problems do you see? And they can build up support within a community so that if there is a negative incident, they've already created a network and established a perspective where the community is going to trust them and be less likely to buy into negative information. I've certainly seen effective police leaders do that. They have a network in the community. When there's a problem, they activate that network. They're very available to go to meetings. They're very present on social media. I think the problem with police leaders comes when they're reactive in dealing with the media, and they feel upset and respond when the police say something, there's something negative said about the police in the mass media. I think you have to get in front of that. You have to build a positive presence on social media in advance. You know, there are all kinds of things you can do. You can have community newsletters, you can have community meetings, you can have community social media networks. All of those things are a way to push out information on a consistent basis to try to create a positive feeling in the community.
And hence why conferences like this are important. And again, for those of you who are posting on social media now, you can do so. Hashtag ANZSEBP 2021. Another question here, Tom, is police legitimacy being well researched in the field of criminology? And where are some of the knowledge gaps, in your opinion?
I feel like there's a very solid base of empirical research to indicate that police legitimacy has a strong effect on compliance with the law, cooperation with the police, and engagement in the community. I think an area of research that is less well developed, that we need more work, is exactly what do the police need to do when they deal with people in the community to create legitimacy. We know that procedural justice is an important idea, but like what in particular should the police be doing? What specific kinds of actions should they take? We have some ideas about, but I think we need a lot more information. The other thing I think we need more information about is how policing is experienced in minority groups. As I mentioned, in America, Black Americans are a very important minority group and much more alienated from the police than white Americans. Fortunately, we do find that in America, Black Americans respond to the same kinds of behaviors and issues when they deal with the police that everyone else does. But I don't think we can assume that that's true of all minorities. For example, I know in Australia, you deal with a number of minorities that are immigrants from Asian countries. We need to understand better what kind of policing strategies lead people in those groups to feel that they got fairness. So I think those are a couple of things we need to know more about. But I would very strongly argue that the basic importance of legitimacy is well established at this point by quite a bit of research.
Thank you, Tom. Just a couple more. This one from Andy Nichols. Thank you, Andy, for this question. Do you think that to provide consent and evidence-led policing requires an extension of the typical response-led software solutions that underpin the warrior approach?
I think that the thing that we want to do is we want to create a model where early on in the process, whether it's through a call center or however the police initially get information, where we deploy the right skill set to the right problem. I think that can be an issue of software. It can be an issue of well-trained operators, but we want to separate out a small set of cases that might require a more force-based approach and the very large set of cases that really don't benefit most from that approach. And we want to try to send another kind of person, a differently trained police officer or a social worker or whatever, to manage those kinds of situations. And then, of course, a big innovation in policing that's helpful is the computers that police often have in their car. So the police officer can get more information. Some of the most upsetting instances in America come when the officer responding doesn't have the correct information, doesn't understand the nature of the problem, and doesn't realize that it's not really a problem that requires the use of force. So we want to try to use technology to get the right person to the right situation and have that person fully informed when they get there.
Thank you. And I think just one more, if we can, Tom. Should police, I think this one, sorry, from Kylie Crawford. Thank you, Kylie, again for that question. Should police staffing levels be aligned to crime rates or population rates?
Well, I would say that police staffing should be aligned to the problems that the police are dealing with. And if crime is low and that's what the police are dealing with, we don't need so many police. But in America, for example, the police do a lot of other things besides directly addressing crime. So either we need those police to be doing that, or we need other people to do it, and then we don't need as many police. But I do think that the number of police officers should be proportionate to the seriousness of the problems that they're dealing with. It's really interesting to me in the current debate in America that people are talking constantly about up and down in the level of policing in small amounts, when no one's really talking about the fact that we have many more police now than we had in an earlier low crime era. It just seems like change from the status quo always sounds dangerous.
Professor Tom Tyler, we really appreciate your presentation and the time that you have taken to answer the range of questions that have come from those watching this live stream, this virtual conference, the attendees to the conference this year. We're delighted for the panel to be able to join us now. So thank you all very much for being available for this discussion. Dr. Reedy, I will hand over to you now.
Thank you very much. I'm thrilled to be here. I'm going to pass off to Superintendent David Cowan to open.
Okay, thanks, Justin. Well, we've had a great chat, Justin and Tom and myself in the green room as we've waited to commence this session. We weren't sure if Tom was going to join us, but we're very privileged that he's staying up late to be a part of this discussion with us. It's going to be pretty informal. I said we're adopting a sort of a coffee shop type approach to this. So we're just going to have a chat with each other and hopefully share some of our thoughts with you on Tom's presentation and scratch the surface a bit more. Justin and I have picked a couple of short clips from Tom's original session, and we're going to use them just to think through some of the issues around police legitimacy. So I think, Justin, is that a good cue to go to the first clip, or did you want to introduce that first?
Yeah, that's great. So previously we heard from Tom, who discussed the paradox that the U.S. has undergone a substantial crime drop with very little increase in trust in the police. So let's begin with the first talking point, and then we can kind of discuss that. Let's take a listen to Tom from back in August.
Recent surveys suggest that about 77% of the residents of New Zealand trust their police force, 68% of the residents of Australia. Similarly, 74% of the residents in the United Kingdom express trust in their police. Against this background, it is striking that only 48% of adult Americans express confidence in their local police.
So I just wanted to kind of put this out there as a backdrop. And so I'll open this up with some thoughts, and then I'll toss it to Tom and David. But what I was interested about is the cross-cultural viability of ideas around procedural justice and how to build philosophical change within police organizations based on the principles of procedural justice. And I thought to myself, is the United States and countries in North America, are they at a fundamentally different place than Australia and New Zealand are for cultural as well as historical reasons? And what got me thinking about this is based on some ongoing work that I've had the honor of doing with David Cowan and with the Victoria Police, where we've divided the city of Melbourne up into micro-locations, street segments. And we look at crime on these street segments, and this is for the purpose of looking at high crime concentrations. But the interesting thing we noticed, a byproduct of this, was that the ratio of calls for service in micro-locations in any geographic area to the number of actual crime incidents that get processed in that area is very high in Australia, much higher. And I've done some earlier work with a number of people, including David Weisbord in Baltimore. And what we find in major cities in the US is that there's about almost an even number of calls for service to crime incidents, actually a bit more calls. But what we're finding in Australia is that there's more than double the number of calls for service. So if a district has, for instance, 40,000 crime incidents, LEAP incidents, or Q prime incidents, it may have 100,000 calls for service. If a street segment has 40 crime incidents, it might have 100 calls for service. And this makes me wonder, do people in Australia fundamentally believe it's worth calling the police? Maybe my time isn't wasted calling the police. Maybe this is fundamentally different. So the last thing I'll say then is, does this have implications for how to actually execute procedural justice interventions in Australia? Are they different? Should we isolate certain pillars, for instance, in Australia that might not be key pillars in the US? So I'll pass this to David and Tom.
So just a couple of observations. I mean, we come from a position, I suppose, in Australia and New Zealand where we have relatively high levels of trust and confidence in police. Now, maybe some of that trust is sort of passed on to us from our families and our values, etc. And part of it is passed on to us from our experience with the police. And as a senior police officer, you hear about some of the failures of police service a lot, but we don't hear about the good service that's provided. And I know over the pandemic, the police have had to apply a myriad of different rules to the public in situations that they normally wouldn't be put in. And I have a high degree of confidence that in the large, the police had strong motivations to exercise good judgment, to deal with people well, appreciating the challenges that lockdown and restrictions have on you. I've seen the police in the lines at the border checkpoints talking to people in the cars, and I've had feedback from people who've dealt with the police, and it's actually very positive. So I've got to check myself sometimes because I think we have earned that respect here. But I also come from a position that you can't just accept the trust and confidence you have. You have to be very careful to nurture it, and you need to be very careful not to erode it. And the pillars of procedural justice and the concepts of police legitimacy are foundational issues for police to think through. How can we apply that in all sorts of circumstances? And we've tried to do that in a number of different situations here in Victoria, because that is the best evidence, and we can contribute to the confidence that the public have in police by really thinking through those concepts. And I'd encourage all the police listening to look at some of Tom's work and Lorraine's work, and it will resonate with you. You will actually click with it. You'll go, yeah, I understand that. It's in its simplest form when a mother rolls through a stop sign on the way to work or to drop their kid off to a childcare centre, and the police officer interacts with them. It's not about whether they get a ticket. It's about the police officer allowing that person to speak, to have a voice, to be dealt with respectfully, to vent and say, look, I'm running late, I've got my kids there and I've got to get to work and all that. Okay, that's fine. We want to keep the community safe. We want to show trustworthy motives. Are you going to get a ticket? Now, some people in those situations will say, yeah, the police are actually quite good. I got a ticket. It's not about the outcome. It's actually about how we treat people. And that's so important. So I've said enough. I'll let Tom throw his bit in.
No, well, I actually pick up on what David said. I think we can take that very same argument and run it through calls, because we find in our research that when someone calls the police for help, the most important issue to them in the way they end up feeling is whether they think the police treat them fairly, and that even has more impact than whether they solve the problem about which they're called. So it's an arena where the police have considerable capability of improving their relationship with the community. And obviously that relationship is better in Australia and New Zealand, but still, I mean, we can always make it better than it is at any given point. And in America, that's very much of an issue where it's much lower. The other thing that I would say is we're seeing that calls are something that people can also just simply not do. So relating to Justin's comment, we've seen some research recently that when the police act in some way that the public feels is egregious, a misuse of force, calls to the police drop dramatically. And what happens is people only call the police if they see no other alternative, like if there's a serious crime going on, but in other cases, they don't. So there's kind of a mixed bag here. And I think that what a lot of departments are realizing is they should really be getting out in front in call response and trying to use that as an opportunity to build up a reservoir of trust and good feeling in the public. Because really, and this is just echoing what David said, it shouldn't be difficult to do that, since maybe, you know, someone calls you, their TV was stolen, you can't get the TV back. But that's not really the issue. You can treat the person with respect. You can listen to them. You can explain what you're going to do about it. You can show concern for them. So it's really something that should be easy to do in almost all situations.
Yeah, this is really important. I think it connects to some of the earlier research on response time too. John Eck and Bill Spellman did some initial work on satisfaction with the police based on how long it took them to respond to calls for service. And what they find is that essentially it's the expectation of when the police should arrive will arrive. And if you set expectations correctly, then people are generally satisfied with the response. But even if it's a longer response time. So I think that this all kind of connects nicely. And it leads into my next talking point. So earlier we heard Tom discuss what he calls the warrior culture in American, or what he and others have called the warrior culture in American policing. So now let's turn our attention and listen to Tom from back in August on the warrior culture in American policing.
What is more important from my perspective is that the police have continued to police with a warrior style focused on combating violent crime and criminals. The warrior culture of American policing trains officers to approach problems primarily through the lens of using force to compel compliance. This skill set is a mismatch for what the police do today. Studies of what the police do all day suggest that the warrior skill set is central to only around 4% of the tasks that the police perform in their daily job.
I love that quote. So this has got me thinking about some work that I've been doing with video data. I mean, we tend to think of body-worn video as an intervention of sorts, some type of accountability mechanism. But the reality is body-worn video footage is opening up so many opportunities as a rich data source for understanding how human transactions unfold and how the trajectory of those transactions can change or de-escalate depending on the circumstances and the subtleties of human behavior in shaping the outcomes of those social interactions. And I think that when we talk about warrior culture, it's good to also recognize an opposite type of kind of police persona, if you will, which is something that we've been calling a guardian voice. And so what I've been doing some work with David, and we're in an early stages of a project where we're trying to look at mental health calls where individuals might be mentally ill and in crisis, and looking at what happens during those social transactions that lead to de-escalation, that lead to a quicker resolution. And one of the interesting things that relates to kind of what Tom was saying is what we're thinking of doing is coding police behavior, or police voice as either authoritative voice or guardianship voice. And I think this is interesting, and it definitely shapes how people respond to police. And I'll list one other thing, which is this. In our video coding that we've been doing, we ask people to rate their opinions of the police officer. And a lot of times it's not the big kind of actions that lead people to get pissed off with the police. A lot of times it's small, subtle behaviors, really nuanced things. And it's not one big action, because if officers have to use coercive force, a lot of times they're presented with physical resistance. And so one of the things that we notice, for instance, is that when in the videos that we have, when officers roll their eyes and have a look of condescension, a patronizing look, when you have some videos, across the board, people who watch those videos are really frustrated with the police because it connotes something interesting that you're not worth my time. I'm above you in some way. So I just want to turn now to Tom and to David and ask you about this and about social transactions and around this issues of how to circumvent this warrior culture and how we might use our understanding of social interactions in order to improve how police kind of deal with situations, de-escalate situations.
Just to give you a little bit of context to the discussion that Justin and I have been having is when we attend jobs relating to mental health issues, what we're seeing is that there's a very high proportion of those attendances that result in physical injury of the police officer because the situation escalates and there's physical force used between the police and that person. And we want to keep the police safe. We want to keep the public safe. And the thinking that we've had is, well, what are the things that escalate those situations? Yes, they're volatile. Someone's not well in a suffering a mental health episode, but we're looking for some of the things that police do that might calm the situation down, or conversely, what are the things that the police do that are going to escalate the situation and result in physical force being used. So that's a bit of the background to that body-worn camera trial that we're looking to do, or analysis. And at the heart of it, what are the things that create a civilizing effect, as Justin referred to? You know, what things might calm a situation down? And it goes to that issue around trustworthy motives. You know, how can we apply trustworthy motives in an operational setting that's a bit dynamic and on edge? And that's one of the challenges that we're looking at.
Well, so again, I would very much agree with David's comments as he ended in saying that what we really need to understand is that people who are dealing with the police find that to be a potentially threatening situation, especially in America. The police are armed. And that if the police can project an air of reassurance, and I love the word guardian because it implies that the person would feel that the officer is trying to protect them, to be concerned about them, to present an image of respect for them, that we know that this lowers the temperature. And basically, mental health calls in America are also the most upsetting calls for police officers because the high level of injury for officers. So it's the same line of argument that it's not different than other calls, but it's kind of more so, that we need to be able to project these things to lower the temperature. The other aspect of this study, which is fantastic to me, is that we've had a lot of trouble linking what the police do, like the actions the police take, to the way they're experienced. And I think I agree with you, Justin, that the body-worn cameras could be a big innovation for us in terms of connecting the actions of police officers to the perceptions of the people they deal with, to help us more clearly say to the officers, these are the kinds of things that are good or bad. But also in my work, I see exactly the same thing that you reported, that if the authority, whether it's a judge or a police officer, shows disrespect or some sign of indifference, like they won't make eye contact or they won't use your name, people cue in on that really immediately. And I think it goes back to the idea of not being reassured, not feeling this is a guardian, this is a threat. And so it is an area where, fortunately, in America, there's a lot of research, and the procedural justice model works very well in mental health intervention situations, Justin, for exactly the reasons that you were laying out.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we think about these interactions, a lot of times we traditionally look for something like a turning point where things go pear-shaped. But actually, the research that I've been doing with Western Australia video and that we want to do in Victoria is actually finding that it's not about a change in the trajectory of the situation. It's almost like death by 1,000 little cuts. Mm-hmm. And there's research in psychology on disgust, which is interesting. So we're really talking about whether we should change our thinking and view this almost as a threshold effect, where enough distasteful things happen to a certain point where people watching that interaction suddenly feel a sense of disgust. And I don't use the term disgust in a pop cultural sense, but in the way that psychologists might use it, as something that makes you feel uneasy. So listen,
the other, Justin, the other end of what you were saying there is, and we talked about it the other day when we were having a chat, is, so you got the death by 1,000 cuts, the small things, but at the other end, you've got when you are shut down and someone will not let you be a participant in the outcome, well, that's a guaranteed sort of path to resistance, because when you are powerless and not a participant and not listened to and not treated well, that's the worst possible outcome. We've all been in situations where someone won't let us speak, and that's infuriating. And throw that in the midst of a crisis. When police attend, it's not a good day. Everything's gone wrong. So throw that in the midst of a crisis and you're definitely on a path to a poor outcome.
Listen, I love this because I'm a little bit starstruck to be able to be here in this panel with Tom Tyler. So I'm going to finish off with my favorite quote of Tom's. So back in August, Tom talked about the payoffs of legitimacy-based policing, and I just, this is a short quote, but I think this was a very powerful statement. So let's listen to that.
More generally, legitimacy encourages everyday law abidingness as effectively as does a sanction-based approach. The payoff of legitimacy-based policing is that trust motivates cooperation more effectively than does sanctioning.
So again, I think that was just such a to-the-point, poignant point that encapsulates so much of what we're talking about. So I'm going to fade back. I'm going to say one last thing. I want to acknowledge again that this is like 11:30 p.m. for Tom. So I want to thank Tom for spending time with us when he should be sleeping. And I want to turn this to David. David has been working on a procedural justice experiment in Victoria for quite some time. So I think that we might share the rest of this time with David and Tom, maybe having a bit of a conversation about this ongoing trial, because it speaks to exactly this point that you made back in August, Tom.
So just to set the scene on that, so in the midst of COVID lockdown and restrictions and curfews and everything else that was happening, we trained a group of officers from our region who were performing those compliance duties. We called it Operation Sentinel, and that was their job, to go out and make sure that people were not breaching the health directions. And we trained them up, or gave them information about the pillars of procedural justice, showing respect in the encounter, allowing the person to speak, being neutral and not assuming they're doing something wrong. And ultimately, by everything you do, your actions, the way you speak, the way you stand, showing trustworthy motives, showing to them that you actually genuinely and authentically want to assist, okay? So we trained the officers up, and at the conclusion of those interactions, they were to give out a QR code which took the person to a survey, and we had a group of officers who hadn't been trained. And the officers that were trained, we got some fantastic results back. They had to, the member of the public had to grade the officer. Were they respectful? Did they listen to you? Did they care? And there was about 8 different measures, and they were all rated on a scale of 1 to 5, around 4 point something. So they were all pretty high. Now, obviously the officers might have selected the interactions that were more positive, but it was just a shame that we couldn't compare it to the group that weren't trained, because those officers that weren't trained initially weren't giving out the cards. Now, that in itself is interesting, because why did the officers who were trained give out the cards? And why did the officers that weren't trained not give out the cards? So something has happened there in the first place before you even get to the results. But it would have been good to compare the two results to see if there was any differences. But, you know, we did this. It was difficult because we were in chaos, you know, things were happening and rules and laws were changing, and it would have been easier not to do it and just go out there and do it. But we had to go, and we learned something from it. I think if I did it again, I think the training is something we could have done better. I think maybe some of the officers maybe didn't, maybe the way in which we conducted the training got their back up a little bit. So, and that's fair enough. The best way to get the officers on board is to actually probably show them some interactions that are difficult, and show them how a police officer has skillfully used the pillars of procedural justice to actually mitigate these circumstances. And I think that's where body worn again might come in. So if I did it again, that's probably what I would do, because they can see the value in that when they watch that type of footage. So that's the context to that trial, Tom.
Well, first, it sounds like a great study. And I think there's other research that very much supports the argument you're making that a big benefit of treating people fairly is that they more willingly cooperate. And, you know, one of the big frequent complaints about the police have about the public is people won't cooperate. And so in the studies we've done, we often see the police say that their clearance rates go up a lot if they build a better cooperative atmosphere in the community, because people are more willing to talk to them, to tell them, you know, where's the criminal who committed the crime, so that there are mutual benefits to the community and the police from having a more cooperative relationship. But certainly from the point of view of the police, the benefits are that you have a better ability to do your jobs because people are helping you. The other thing I would say, David, I thought your comment was really interesting about the officers. There's been a lot of success using procedural justice within police departments. That is, if officers experience procedural justice when they deal with their superiors, they're also more likely to do good things in the community, because they learn that that's the way you deal with people, is fairly. And then it just moves out into the community. So that might be another way to think about an augmentation to training of officers, is try to think about how can we basically demonstrate to officers that these are good ideas by having them experience them in their own jobs.
That's a really interesting comment, Tom, because you're talking about taking some of the philosophical components of PJ and applying it to employees of police organizations. And it actually relates to an ongoing supervision that I'm doing right now with one of my graduate students. We have data that we collected with Western Australia Police. And one of the things that, as an outcome measure, we're looking at officers' acceptance of technology, right? So think about kind of some of the obstacles that police officers have in accepting new technologies, especially when that technology inhibits their autonomy or their freedom of movement in some way. And we have a number of measures that look specifically at GPS tracking of officers' movements and knowing where officers are at any moment in time. And so that's our outcome measure. But what's interesting about this is we've collected data on the individual officers, as well as the safety benefits of GPS tracking officers and the managerial benefits, the management and planning benefits of GPS tracking, everything from active shooter incidents to tracking calls as they're unfolding, that kind of thing, to pursuits. But anyways, one of the things that we're looking at is we're predicting what best predicts officers' acceptance of new technologies that actually restrict them in some ways. And what we're finding, interestingly, is that the safety benefits and managerial benefits all matter. but it's how they feel within the organization. If they believe the organization makes decisions based on their best interest and consults them, and that they're respected by their supervisors, and that their supervisors check in with them at the right times and talk about the right things, then those individuals are most accepting of technologies that might make their lives more difficult or more restricted, but yet they're willing to accept that technology. And I was kind of thinking about this and connecting it to Roger's work on the diffusion of innovation and things like that. But yes, so it very much relates to what you were just saying, Tom.
Great. You know, the one other thing I would say is I think we also need to think about the well-being of officers. At least in America, policing is a very stressful job, and police have lots of health costs of being officers. So an additional benefit of working in a fair organization is that employee health is better. Suicide is lower, alcoholism is lower, you know, a lot of heart stress related illnesses are lower. So this also benefits the officers who feel in a less stressful environment and live a better life, basically.
So I think that is a really good note to wind up. I knew I would have to chop this off because we could keep talking for quite some time, and Tom has to get to bed as well. So I'd like to thank you, Tom, both for coming back for the second time in your original presentation. It's been a highlight of the conference. Hopefully we can have that coffee together in a coffee shop sometime one day. That would be great.
That'd be wonderful.
Justin,
I'll look forward to that day. Yes.
Thank you. And Justin, as well to you, thanks for your contribution and ongoing support of me and the society. Much appreciated.
Thank you for allowing me to be here.
Thank you all very much, Justin, Dave, and also Tom. It was great to have you at such a late hour. I just want to hold on for one more minute, if that's okay, because we have had a question come from the audience, and it is a good one, and I wanted to pose it actually to the panel for an answer. It's from Jonathan Totman, and he asks, to what extent does Wilson's topology of policing styles impact the ratios between Maryland and Victoria? Watchmen in the USA, service in Appelian policing style in Victoria Legislative and other parts of Oceania. So I just wanted to put that to the panel to get some comment, if that's okay. Who'd like to start?
There was a bit in that, and I was going to sort of defer to Tom to that one. Have you got any comments straight off the bat off that, Tom?
No. I would say that one of the things that's very important in that question is a recognition that a more informal style of policing is not a new thing, and that it has been part of theories about policing for a long time. It's been really kind of lost in America recently, but not in other countries as much. But a more informal interpersonal style like Muir's street corner politician is another example of that. So there's a long history of thinking of the police as more informal social order maintenance, people who are more connected to their community. I, of course, think that's a great tradition and certainly consistent with some of the arguments of procedural justice.
I'd like to add a comment too that builds on what Tom was saying. When we think about kind of the classification system that Wilson was kind of thinking about, I think it applies a bit differently in an Australian and a New Zealand context than in an American context, because there's a lot of transitioning. Australian policing is much more centralized, and people actually, especially as they climb the ranks and go through leadership roles, they're actually forced to actually take on different roles. If you're an inspector, you stay in the same place in Queensland for 3 to 5 years, and then they force you to learn a whole different skill set. And so officers within an Australia, New Zealand context see themselves as multifaceted. They don't, there's not kind of, this is the primary dimension of my persona, and then this other social work dimension doesn't exist. Whereas in the US, depending on specialization, the type of unit that you're in, it's more likely, I don't want to draw vast conclusions, that you adopt more of a kind of a single persona, kind of that's closer to what you do, that kind of embodies what you do. So I don't know if that made too much sense, but the spirit it was there for a reason. Yeah.
Thank you all very much. Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Tom and Dave. We really do appreciate your time. And Tom, it was so great to have you back with us again. Really appreciate your time given the hour where it is in your part of the world. Thank you all very much to our panel, to Justin, Dave and Tom Tyler as well.